Alright, here's something that will mess with your head. There's a name that floats around in drag racing conversations, dropped casually by guys who lived through the Gasser era, referenced in forum threads, sometimes cited like it's common knowledge. Ed Schartman's Anglia. And the moment you start pulling on that thread, everything unravels in the most fascinating way possible. Because Ed Schartman never raced a Ford Anglia. Not once. Not at any track, in any class, at any point in his entire career. And what that mistake actually reveals are two separate stories, both criminally underknown, both genuinely mind-blowing, stories about strategic genius, accidental invention, and a kid from a Cleveland wrecking yard who became the founding champion of what is now one of the biggest professional motorsport categories on Earth. This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about the forgotten pioneers who shaped drag racing history. If you're someone who loves digging into the real stories behind the legends, the ones that got distorted over decades of retelling, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. So let me set the scene for you. The year is 1965. The NH Nationals at Indianapolis Raceway Park. The biggest drag racing event on the planet. And the gas classes are absolutely loaded that year. The Gasser era is at full peak. Competition in A/gas is the kind of brutal that makes grown men rethink their life choices. Ed Schartman rolls in with his factory Mercury Comet, a legitimate A/FX car backed by the Mercury division of Ford Motor Company. This thing has a 427 cubic inch engine, a grill-mounted Moon fuel tank, and enough modifications to make the NH tech inspectors genuinely uncomfortable. They go through the car with a fine-toothed comb and reclassify it into A/gas, which is, as it turns out, a brutal place to land. Because A/gas that year contains some of the nastiest purpose-built race cars on the property. And in one of those A/gas elimination rounds, Ed Schartman in his factory Mercury Comet finds himself lined up against Gene Altuser from Arlington, Virginia. Altuser is running a stripped-out 1951 Ford Anglia with a small block Chevy stuffed behind that tiny British grille. Altuser wins the round. Schartman lifts the front wheels hard going into second gear. Altuser takes the tree. So here you have a result that puts the names Schartman and Anglia and A/gas all in the same story, same track, same weekend. And if you're retelling that from memory 15 years later, or reading a summary that dropped one crucial detail, it is completely understandable how Schartman's Anglia becomes a phrase that gets passed around. The thing is, the Anglia wasn't Schartman's. It was the car that beat him. And that car was part of something far bigger than one elimination round at one event. Here's what most people don't realize about Anglia Gassers. The Ford Anglia used by drag racers was almost exclusively the E494A, built between 1948 and 1953. This is the classic upright British economy car. The thing that looks like someone designed it while thinking about aerodynamics exclusively in the wrong direction. Super tall greenhouse, lots of glass, nearly vertical windshield, a short 90-inch wheelbase, and a curb weight in stock form of somewhere around 1,665 pounds. The stock engine displaced 933 cubic inches. That is not a typo. That is less than a liter, making 8 horsepower. Ford imported around 25,000 of them to North America through the early 1950s, and they did not sell well. By the late 1950s and into the early 1960s, you could find these things in junkyards for under $100 in many cases. And here is where the strategic genius enters the picture. Now you might be thinking, how does a cheap British economy car become a serious drag racing weapon? Here's the thing. NH gas coupe and sedan classes used a weight per cubic inch formula to determine class placement. In A/gas, the requirement was 5.00 to 8.99 pounds per cubic inch of engine displacement. The formula is elegant in its simplicity. Heavier car needs a bigger engine. Lighter car can run a smaller engine. So the question becomes, what happens when you take the lightest car you can possibly find and ask what the biggest engine the rules will actually allow you to run in it is? You get a strategic weapon. Do the math on a 327 cubic inch small block Chevy. A gas minimum weight at 327 cubic inches multiplied by 5.0 equals 1,635 pounds. The Anglia in race-prepped form with its driver and fuel probably comes in around 1,700 to 1,800 pounds. So you're sitting right at the absolute bottom of A/gas, running a 327 small block in a car that weighs roughly the same as what many B/gas competitors were using with much smaller engines. You are making legitimate competitive power in a package so light that the laws of physics are basically conspiring in your favor. Think about it from your competitor's perspective. You've spent years developing your blown Willys coupe. You've got a 392 Chrysler Hemis or a blown small block. The car weighs 2,400 pounds, and you've got it dialed in reasonably well. Then some guy rolls up in a tiny British economy car he bought for $90 from a junkyard. He's got a stock configuration 327 Chevy in it, and he is matching you run for run. That is infuriating in a very specific and deeply personal way. Now, before we go deeper into Anglia territory, the rulebook situation needs some attention because the NH had some very particular feelings about this. Standard gas class rules required a minimum 92-inch wheelbase for competition. The Anglia had a 90-inch wheelbase. It didn't qualify under existing rules. And yet, in 1963, the exact year the NH lifted its nitro ban and the Gasser era was truly hitting its stride, the NH published a very specific carve-out in the rulebook. The exact language said something to the effect that all 1948 to 1953 English Fords of the Anglia series, although not meeting minimum wheelbase requirements, are accepted for competition in gas coupes and sedans classes. That is remarkable for a couple of reasons. First, it means enough people were already trying to run these things that NH felt compelled to create a formal ruling. Second, and this is where it gets really interesting, the ruling came with teeth. Anglias were restricted to engines of the 265, 283, or 327 cubic inch Chevrolet family. No larger basic blocks, and critically, no superchargers for NH competition. So in NH, they could run unblown A/gas with a 327 small block. In the NHRA, the American Hot Rod Association, which operated under entirely different rules, the Anglias could run blown setups with much larger engines. And the results were spectacular in a way that genuinely bordered on terrifying. The Kohler brothers out of North Olmsted, Ohio, which, as we'll get to in a moment, is the same Cleveland suburb where Ed Schartman was cutting his teeth, built what they called King Kong. That car ran a blown 454 Chevy. At the 1967 NHRA Winter Nationals, their Anglia posted a 9.42 at 145.63 miles per hour to win Super Eliminator and set a world record in the process. Let that sink in. 9.42 seconds in a car that started life as the automotive equivalent of a postage stamp. The driving experience was reportedly somewhere between exhilarating and genuinely suicidal. The short wheelbase and high center of gravity made these cars violently unstable at speed. Wheel stands were not optional. They happened whether you wanted them to or not. Sometimes all four wheels came off the ground simultaneously. One modern description I came across called it spooky to drive, but absolutely riveting to watch. And that appears to be the consensus from anyone who ever piloted one of these things seriously. So, who are the people actually doing this at a high level? Gene Altuser from Arlington, Virginia is probably the most historically significant figure in the Anglia Gasser story as it relates to what happened at Indianapolis in 1965. He had been running Anglias competitively since the early part of the decade, and he was genuinely skilled at it. He was inducted into the East Coast Drag Times Hall of Fame in 2010, specifically for his Anglia campaign. He won A/Gas at the 1963 NH Nationals, the single biggest event in the sport, and advanced to the modified eliminator final where he lost to Ohio George Montgomery in Montgomery's iconic Willys. So understand what this was. This was not a novelty act. This was a legitimate competitive program run by a skilled racer who understood exactly how to exploit what he had and exactly where the formula gave him an advantage. Up in the Midwest, Ron Hassel and Ronnie Cox out of Cleveland took their 1948 Anglia to the 1966 NH Nationals and won B/Gas outright. Bob Stickle and his partner Riffle, operating out of Columbus under the Rod Shop banner, won B/Gas at the 1967 Nationals and then C/Gas at the 1968 Nationals. 2 years, 2 different NH National Event Class wins. That is a program, not a lucky run. And Riffle later went on to build engines for Richard Petty's NASCAR team, which tells you something concrete about the level of mechanical talent that was flowing through these small operations. Out on the West Coast, Skip Hess, who ran under the Skipper Critter banner, is credited by some sources with coining the term rat motor for the big block Chevy, which, if accurate, means one of the most enduring pieces of drag racing slang in the history of the sport came from a guy campaigning an Anglia Gasser. His car set the A/Gas speed record of 137.40 miles per hour at Half Moon Bay, running an unblown small block with a B&M Hydromatic automatic transmission. Down in the New York and East Coast scene, Jim Zakia picked up multiple national A/Gas wins and records, and the East Coast Drag Times Hall of Fame has him documented as a multi-time national champion in the class. The community of Anglia racers was geographically spread across the country, but connected by match racing circuits, drag racing publications, and the kind of informal knowledge transfer that happened in the pits when competitors recognized they were all solving the same problem with the same basic tools. Look, the early to mid-1960s Gasser era was, in many ways, the most exciting period drag racing ever produced at the class car level. The NH had banned nitromethane fuel in 1957, and while that decision was reversed in 1963, the 6-year drought had created an incredibly deep and competitive ecosystem in the gas classes. A/Gas supercharged was the glamour division. That's where Ohio George Montgomery with his Willys coupe was cleaning up year after year, and where Stone, Woods and Cook out of Los Angeles were running their swindler and drawing crowds that simply wanted to watch these things try to eat themselves alive on the starting line. Ohio George was the benchmark. 8 NH national event titles, 4 U.S. Nationals wins, and the NHRA eventually placed him at number 28 on their all-time top 50 list. You measured your setup against where Ohio George was. Stone, Woods and Cook had something else going on simultaneously. Fred Stone and Leonard Tim Woods were black car owners competing in a sport that was almost entirely white at the time, and they were doing it successfully, partnered with Doug Cook as their driver. At a moment when American society was in the thick of the civil rights movement, here was an integrated team not just participating but winning at the highest competitive level of their class. That story does not get told nearly enough, and it deserves its own dedicated examination. The manufactured rivalry between Stone, Woods and Cook and Big John Mazmanian's Candy Apple Red 1941 Willys out of East Los Angeles was the centerpiece draw of the whole gas class scene, and their regular showdowns at Lyons Dragstrip filled the house every single time. This was the world the Anglia entered. And what the Anglia represented by the mid-1960s wasn't novelty or gimmickry. The rush toward lighter and more extreme body choices had been underway for years as teams figured out what the weight formula actually rewarded in practice. By the time Anglias were showing up in numbers, the movement was already established. From 1932 and 1934 Fords to Willys coupes to Austins and now these tiny British economy cars, each generation was lighter and more radical than the previous one. The Anglia wasn't weird in context. The Anglia was the logical endpoint of a competitive trend that had been building for an entire decade. So now let's come back to Ed Schartman, because his story runs parallel to all of this and intersects with it in that 1965 moment at Indianapolis before going somewhere completely different that is equally, maybe even more fascinating. Ed Schartman Jr. grew up in Berea, Ohio, a suburb southwest of Cleveland. His father, Ed Sr., raced dirt track sprint cars and owned a wrecking yard. That combination, racing in the bloodline and unlimited access to engines and chassis and fabrication tools, shaped everything that followed. He was at the racetrack for the first time at age 6. By 14, he had built his first drag car. A 1940 Ford with a modified flathead engine, assembled in what I have to imagine was a fairly chaotic garage environment. He enrolled in every shop class, metalworking course, and auto mechanics program his high school offered. When he graduated in 1956, he drove a 1956 Chevy with a stroked-out 338 cubic inch engine from Cleveland all the way to Flagler Beach, Florida for Daytona Speed Week. The NH feature from 2016 quotes him, saying he won everything in sight down there. Back home in Cleveland, he set the NHB/Gas national record with a full-race 1955 Chevy sedan. By the early 1960s, he was running a 1933 Willys in A/Gas supercharged, a car confirmed by a photograph described in East Coast Drag Times materials as clipped from an old issue of National Dragster. He was deeply embedded in the Anglia Gasser scene, an informal Cleveland area group that included Ron Hassel, the same Hassel who would win NHB/Gas with his Anglia in 1966, along with Sam Gellner, Gene Schwartz, the Hill brothers, Virgil Cates, David Meal, Mickey Hart, Dave Koffel, Arlon Vankay, and the Rodriguez brothers and the Harudka brothers. The Harudkas were racing out of their wrecking yard while also making and selling performance gaskets from the trunk of a car. That operation eventually grew into a company called Mr. Gasket, which became one of the biggest names in aftermarket performance parts in the country. The Cleveland Gasser scene was genuinely loaded with talent at every level. Schartman was working at Jack Shaw Chevrolet in Cleveland, a dealership with a direct pipeline to high-performance Chevy parts, and through that connection he got to know Dino Don Nicholson. Nicholson at that point was one of the most recognized names in superstock drag racing and was making the transition into factory-backed machinery. In 1964, Nicholson received a factory Mercury A/FX Comet wagon. Mercury called it the Ugly Duckling, which is a marketing decision I would genuinely love to have been present for. Nicholson offered Schartman a job in Atlanta building engines, and when the factory supplied Nicholson with a new Comet coupe, Schartman took over the old Nicholson 1962 Chevy, racing it for a 50-50 split of the winnings. The NH feature quotes him describing that arrangement as making a killing down south. But the Mercury people were understandably unhappy seeing their competitor's name on a Chevrolet in winner's circle photos, so when Nicholson moved fully to Mercury machinery, Schartman eventually got the wagon, the Ugly Duckling itself. He won Mr. Stock Eliminator at the 1965 NASCAR Winter Drags in DeLand, Florida with that car, and Superstock magazine named him 1965 Rookie of the Year. The 50-50 arrangement with Nicholson had become strained by this point. The relationship, according to multiple sources, had gotten, quote, quite rocky. Schartman wanted his own program, and Mercury valued him enough to make it happen. He got his own Comet with a $5,000 sponsorship from Cleveland area Mercury dealers. And then he showed up at Indianapolis with that car. The tech inspectors reclassed it into A/Gas, and Gene Altuser's Anglia took him out in the eliminations. So now all three pieces of the story are in the same location at the same time. Schartman, Altuser, Anglia, one elimination round. And 50 years later someone is telling someone else about Schartman's Anglia at the 1965 Nationals, and one critical detail has slipped in transmission. The actual stories are always more complicated and almost always more interesting than the simplified version. Here's what was actually happening to Ed Schartman in December of 1965, while the Anglia Gasser scene was developing into a genuine competitive force in gas coupes and sedans. Mercury racing boss Fran Hernandez and his technical director, Al Turner, had been working on something that nobody in drag racing had ever built at production scale before. Turner built a quarter-scale model out of balsa wood to get corporate approval for the concept. Then he went to Ron and Jean Log of Log Stamping Company in Fraser, Michigan, and commissioned a chromoly tube frame chassis, essentially a dragster, with a stock 116-inch wheelbase and a fiberglass body sitting on top of it that looked vaguely like a Mercury Comet if you squinted at the right angle. The body was hinged at the front, so it lifted as a single piece to provide access to the engine. The driver sat further back than in a conventional car because the engine sat further forward relative to the driver position than in any street car. Nobody had a name for what this thing was yet. Four Mercury-backed drivers received these machines: Nicholson, Schartman, Jack Chrysler, and the Ken and Leslie team. Schartman drove from Cleveland to Motor City Dragway in Fraser, Michigan in December 1965 to see his car for the first time. He walked through the door and looked at the machine. And his response, quoting himself directly in the 2016 NH feature, was this. He said, "I walked in there, looked at the car and said, 'What the hell is this?' It was a dragster with a body on it and the driver in the back seat and not the front seat where you belong." He reportedly told them he couldn't drive something like that. They told him it was his car. Get in. His first pass ran 166 miles per hour and took out the finish line light. He said it took him several runs to get the hang of it, and then, like any drag racer worth his salt, you got used to the speed and you loved it. This is where it gets really interesting. The car he had just climbed into would eventually be called a funny car. That term did not exist yet in December 1965. It came into common use over the following year as these tube chassis flip-top machines started appearing in numbers at NH events, and the older gassers and superstockers sitting in the pits looked at them and said something to the effect of, "Man, that is a funny-looking car." The name stuck permanently. Ron Log is credited with inventing the hinged flip-top body concept and the structural approach that made it mechanically viable. The chromoly tube cage with a fiberglass body that could be raised for access, the template he and his brother Gene built in that shop in Fraser, Michigan, became the foundation that the entire funny car class was built on for decades to come. Schartman's car in 1966 ran a Ford 427 SOHC engine, the cammer they called it, for the single overhead cam design, with low-stack Hilborn injectors and yellow paint. The name on the body identified it as the RS Mercury, for his first crew chief, a nitro-tuning veteran named Roy Steffi. That partnership ended quickly due to what the NH feature diplomatically describes as philosophical differences. The car ran 80 to 85 match race dates in 1966, starting on the West Coast in winter, then concentrating on the Midwest and East Coast through the season. Schartman was meticulous about his nitro percentages. He described in interviews knowing exactly how much he could run and still keep the motor together, making that calculation race by race based on what he needed to win each specific event. At the 1966 NH Nationals at Indianapolis, Schartman posted 8.28 at 174.41 miles per hour in the S/XS class, which was the NH classification for these new machines, and beat Nicholson in the process. That was a statement run against the most credible competition in the class. Then came October 1966. Southwest Raceway in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The 1966 NH World Finals. And here is where something genuinely historic happened that almost nobody talks about in the right context. The NH had decided to run a dedicated eliminator for the S/XS cars, the flip-top machines. They called it Top Funny Car. 6 entries showed up. Schartman, Nicholson, Chrysler, Ken and Leslie, Maynard Rupp's Gresham Auto Supply, and Larry Reyes in the Kingfish Barracuda. 6 cars lined up for the first funny car eliminator in NH history. Schartman beat Reyes in round 1, took a semi-final bye and ran the weekend's low elapsed time on that pass, an 8.60. Then Nicholson in the final. Schartman ran 8.38 at 174.08 miles per hour. Nicholson's car went wrong and he struggled to a 10.60. Gene Snow in his rambunctious Dodge Dart won the lower funny car class and had to face Schartman on Sunday. Snow red-lighted trying to compensate for the speed differential. Ed Schartman won the first NH Funny Car Eliminator Championship in history. That is not a regional title. That is not a record in some obscure subclass. That is the founding moment of what is now one of the two biggest professional drag racing categories in the world. Let me sit with that for a second because I think people hear it and the magnitude doesn't fully land. Every funny car that John Force has ever driven traces its competitive lineage to that October night in Tulsa when 6 cars lined up and Schartman went 8.38 and nobody in the building fully understood yet what they had just created. The class was invented in the middle of its own first championship event, and a kid from a wrecking yard in Berea, Ohio walked out the other side of it as the first champion it ever produced. The 1967 season brought significant development. Schartman had a new crew chief, a Californian nicknamed Famous Amos Satterley, who was an expert with supercharger setups, and a major new sponsor in Airlift Company, whose truck and vehicle leveling products became the headline name on what was now called the Airlift Rattler. The car got a new paint scheme, a new identity, and the campaign continued at full pace. At Detroit Dragway in April 1967, Schartman is credited in some accounts with making the first 7-second elapsed time run in a stock-bodied car. Both he and Nicholson claimed this distinction, and Schartman himself acknowledged in the 2016 NH interview that the timing systems of the era were imprecise enough that nobody could say definitively who ran sevens first. The honest answer based on what I found is that the specific claim cannot be independently verified and both drivers likely had legitimate cases to make. What the sources agree on is that the cars were genuinely approaching that barrier simultaneously in early 1967. What can be verified happened at Maple Grove Raceway in 1967. The car was going sideways in the lights because the rear end was nearly coming off the ground under full throttle acceleration. The aerodynamic forces at those speeds were lifting the tail and making the car unstable and dangerous in a way that needed an immediate solution. So Schartman's crew did what drag racers have always done when facing a technical problem with no established precedent. They improvised. One of the crew went to a hardware store and came back with some angle iron. They bolted it to the trunk lid at an angle to redirect the airflow and pushed down on the rear of the car. The car went straight. It picked up 5 miles per hour on the top end. Here's what most people don't realize. They had just built a rear deck spoiler. The aerodynamic concept now used on every high-performance road car in the world, from a $40,000 sports car to a $1 million Formula One machine, was first applied to a race vehicle using hardware store angle iron at a drag strip in Pennsylvania. And they had no idea what they had done. We invented the spoiler and didn't even know it is precisely how Schartman described it. And then he noted that the car was now running 190 miles per hour and Nicholson was still in the 180s, and believe me, he heard about it. That kind of detail sticks. By 1968, the Airlift Rattler Mercury Cougar, a Stage 2 log chassis running a supercharged and fuel-injected 427 slhc on nitromethane through a Kragar transmission, was running elapsed times in the 7.40 range and exceeding 205 miles per hour. This was a fully evolved funny car at the absolute peak of its development period. The concept that Schartman had looked at in December 1965 and said, "What the hell is this?" had become one of the fastest vehicles on Earth. And then the factory pulled out completely. Ford and Mercury dropped their funny car backing late in 1968. The class had become genuinely dangerous. Fires were happening at speed. The aerodynamics of these early cars were not well understood, and serious accidents and fatalities across the class had created real concern about the direction things were heading. The factories got nervous about the association and withdrew their funding. Schartman negotiated a settlement, described in accounts as a low six-figure number, to fund a 1969 campaign with the existing car. It did not go well. First-round losses at the Winter Nationals, at the Spring Nationals, and at Indianapolis. He was eliminated by Rich Sarunian on a hole shot at Pomona, where Sarunian ran 8.45 while Schartman ran 8.39, but the reaction time differential decided it. And then he fouled out against Bruce Larson at Indianapolis. The machinery was still fast, but the team was operating without the factory infrastructure that had supported everything from parts procurement to tuning resources. He retired from funny cars after 1969. A pro-stock career followed through the early 1970s with a Boss 429 Mercury Cougar and later a Ford Maverick. He went up against Bill Jenkins and Ronnie Sox and Bob Glidden, the absolute A-list of pro-stock competition, and found the margins brutally thin. The most absurd moment of that period came at the 1972 Gator Nationals. Schartman showed up with his Ford Maverick. The NH Tech inspectors went through the car and noticed that the tail lights were Mercury Comet tail light. Technically, that made the car a different make than the body claimed. They reclassed it to be /gas in modified Eliminator. He ran the class, advanced to the final, and lost only to Dennis Grove. The combination of razor-thin margins against elite pro-stock competition and the practical economics of match racing in the 1970s, where rain-out payments of $150 did not cover travel expenses, eventually pushed him out of the sport entirely. He went into the automobile business, operating Great Northern Dodge in North Olmsted, Ohio, and later ran Napa Auto Parts stores. When Phil Burgess from the NH sat down with him for the 2016 feature, he found a 78-year-old man playing golf every day, splitting time between Ohio and Florida, and looking back on a career with the settled satisfaction of someone who knew they had done something nobody else had done before. "We lived and died racing," is how he put it. "We didn't do anything but work on our cars and find a place to go racing. It was a great life and left me with a lot of good memories. So let's put this together and figure out what we're actually looking at." The Anglia Gasser story and the Ed Schartman story cross paths at Indianapolis in 1965 in one elimination round and then diverge completely. The Anglia racers kept running their class programs through the late 1960s, extracting every possible advantage from those weight break rules until the NH finally reduced the minimum wheelbase requirement from 92 to 90 inches in 1968, which technically legitimized the Anglia's understandard rules but came too late to matter much. The NH eliminated the gas classes entirely in 1972, the same year Schartman was getting reclassed at the Gator Nationals. The weight formula that had made the Anglia so effective simply ceased to exist as a competitive framework. The Anglia wasn't weird in its era. It was the logical endpoint of a decade of competitive thinking. And now those same cars are the stars of nostalgia events across the country, the Southeast Gassers Association, Byron Dragway Glory Days, the March Meet at Famoso, because everything that made them terrifying in competition, the short wheelbase, the violent weight transfer, the mandatory wheel stand on a clean launch, makes them absolutely spectacular to watch. There are people building new Anglia Gassers right now trying to replicate what Althusser and Hassel and Stickle and Riffle were doing 60 years ago. And Schartman was inducted into the International Drag Racing Hall of Fame in 2012 at the Don Garlits Museum in Ocala, Florida, the citation covering the 89% win rate, the first funny car title, the spoiler, and the overall foundational impact of his campaign on an entire professional racing category. Both of these stories got compressed into a four-word phrase that doesn't accurately describe either one of them. That's how history works. Sometimes details slip in transmission, and suddenly there's a fact circulating that is assembled from real events shuffled into the wrong order. The actual stories are always more complicated and almost always more interesting than the version that survived. This one is no exception. And now you know the real version of both.